The Persian Gulf has long been one of the most strategically significant waterways in the world, serving as a vital artery for global energy supply and international trade. At the heart of this region lies the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but critical maritime choke point through which nearly one-fifth of the world's daily oil consumption passes. Any disruption in this corridor has immediate ripple effects on global markets, national economies, and geopolitical stability. It is within this tense and heavily monitored environment that the incident involving 3 American-flagged civilian oil tankers unfolded. On the day in question, the tankers were conducting what should have been an entirely routine commercial voyage. Departing from Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates, they were bound for East Asia, supplying energy-hungry economies such as South Korea with crude oil sourced from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait. Collectively, the cargo amounted to approximately $400 million worth of oil, representing not just commercial value, but also strategic importance for downstream nations dependent on uninterrupted energy flows. The vessels themselves were standard commercial tankers, large, slow-moving, and unarmed, operated by civilian crews whose sole mission was the safe and timely delivery of their cargo. Under international maritime law, these ships were fully within their rights. They were transiting through internationally recognized shipping lanes, well outside Iranian territorial waters. Such passages occur thousands of times each year and are protected by long-established legal frameworks designed to ensure freedom of navigation for all nations. These laws are especially crucial in congested and politically sensitive waterways like the Strait of Hormuz, where misunderstandings or deliberate provocations can quickly escalate into international crises. For the tanker crews, this was expected to be another uneventful journey through a familiar route. However, beneath the surface of this routine operation, regional tensions were simmering. Relations between Iran and the United States have been strained for years, marked by economic sanctions, naval confrontations, and competing claims of influence in the Gulf. In this climate, commercial shipping, particularly vessels flagged by the United States, had increasingly become a tool for signaling power and applying pressure. Intelligence assessments gathered by U.S. and allied forces suggested that elements within Iran's military leadership, particularly the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, were considering renewed harassment of American commercial shipping. The objective behind such harassment was not necessarily to trigger a full-scale conflict, but rather to create ambiguity, fear, and political leverage. By intimidating civilian vessels, Iran could project influence, challenge U.S. presence in the region, and test the limits of international response without formally declaring hostilities. Forcing tankers to alter course, conducting aggressive flyovers, or issuing radio threats could all be framed domestically as defensive actions while simultaneously sending a message to global markets and foreign governments. This intelligence context fundamentally shaped how the situation was viewed by U.S. military planners. Although the tankers appeared unescorted on the surface, their movement was closely monitored. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, responsible for naval operations in the region, maintained persistent awareness of shipping traffic and potential Iranian activity. Carrier strike groups and aerial patrols were positioned to respond rapidly should harassment cross the threshold from intimidation into overt hostility. The guiding principle was clear. Civilian shipping in international waters must be protected, and any attempt to undermine freedom of navigation would be treated as a serious escalation. For the tanker crews, however, none of this strategic calculation was visible. Their concerns were practical and immediate: maintaining course, monitoring weather and traffic, and ensuring the safety of hundreds of crew members aboard the 3 vessels. The Strait of Hormuz, while narrow, is normally predictable, governed by established procedures and constant radio communication. Yet the crews were also aware of recent incidents in the region and understood that their American flag made them symbolically significant. That awareness added an undercurrent of tension to an otherwise standard commercial transit. In essence, the background of this incident is defined by contrast. On one side stood lawful, routine international commerce, carried out under protections of maritime law. On the other stood a volatile geopolitical environment in which civilian shipping had become a stage for strategic signaling and confrontation. The tanker's voyage represented the normal functioning of the global economy, while the intelligence warnings hinted at an attempt to disrupt that normalcy for political and military gain. It was this collision between routine commerce and calculated provocation that set the stage for the events that followed. As the three American-flagged oil tankers continued their lawful transit through international waters, the situation began to shift rapidly from routine commerce to overt confrontation. Iranian coastal radar systems activated along the southern shoreline, sweeping the Persian Gulf and locking onto the slow-moving civilian vessels. Shortly thereafter, 6 Iranian Air Force F-4 Phantom fighter jets scrambled from nearby air bases, officially filed as training flights but clearly redirected toward an interception course. These aircraft, though aging by modern standards, remain capable of high-speed, heavy payloads and aggressive close-range intimidation tactics. The Iranian jet approached the tanker convoy at supersonic speed, descending sharply from high altitude in a show of force designed to be both visible and terrifying. As they closed in, afterburners lit and sonic booms echoed across the water, shaking the massive hulls of the tankers and rattling equipment on their decks. Crew members, untrained for combat scenarios, were jolted by the shock waves and sudden realization that they were being targeted by military aircraft. The fighters then dropped to extremely low altitude, some flying just a few hundred feet above the sea surface, and began making aggressive passes directly over the ships. These low-altitude flyovers were not accidental or symbolic. They were deliberate intimidation maneuvers. Flying so close to civilian vessels at high speed creates dangerous turbulence and psychological pressure, increasing the risk of collision or structural damage. From the bridges of the tankers, pilots could clearly see the Iranian insignia on the aircraft as they roared overhead, a message reinforced by the next step in the escalation: direct radio contact. Using international emergency frequencies, the lead Iranian pilot addressed the tanker captains with threatening language, accusing them of transporting stolen oil and claiming Iranian authority over the waters they were transiting. The demand was explicit and uncompromising. The tankers were ordered to change course immediately and proceed toward Iranian ports for inspection. The warning was framed as final, with the implication that refusal would result in force being used against the ships. The tanker captains responded calmly but firmly. They rejected the Iranian claims, stating clearly that they were operating in international waters, carrying legally purchased cargo, and exercising their lawful right to freedom of navigation. They emphasized that Iran had no jurisdiction over their voyage and that they would maintain their assigned course. This refusal was not an act of defiance for its own sake, but a necessary assertion of international law. Complying with Iran's demands would have set a dangerous precedent, effectively allowing military coercion to override established maritime norms. Iran's response to this refusal marked a clear escalation. 2 of the F-4 Phantoms descended even lower, conducting aggressive head-on passes toward one tanker's bridge, forcing minor course corrections and creating the real possibility of an accident. These maneuvers went far beyond signaling or posturing. They demonstrated intent to coerce and potentially endanger civilian lives. The sonic booms, repeated low passes, and explicit threats transformed the encounter from harassment into a hostile act. From a legal and military perspective, this behavior crossed a critical threshold. International law distinguishes between monitoring or escorting vessels and actively threatening them. By attempting to force the tankers into Iranian territorial waters through intimidation and implied violence, Iran was effectively attempting an unlawful seizure of civilian property on the high seas. Such actions are considered acts of aggression, regardless of whether weapons are fired. For the civilian crews, the experience was deeply unsettling. Tankers are not designed to evade fighter jets, nor are their crews trained for combat scenarios. Alarms were sounded, emergency protocols were activated, and distress signals were transmitted requesting immediate assistance. The captains understood that any misstep, panic, miscommunication, or compliance could have serious consequences not only for their ships, but for international shipping as a whole. Iran's strategy relied on a dangerous assumption that civilian vessels, isolated and vulnerable, could be bullied into submission before any meaningful response arrived. The use of older fighter aircraft suggested confidence that intimidation alone would be sufficient, and that the political cost of directly confronting civilian shipping would remain manageable. Iran appeared to believe that the United States would hesitate to escalate in defense of unarmed commercial ships, especially in such a volatile region. In reality, these actions signaled unmistakable hostile intent. The combination of aggressive aerial maneuvers, direct threats, and attempts to alter the tanker's course constituted a deliberate effort to violate freedom of navigation and seize control of a lawful commercial transit. What Iran viewed as calculated pressure was, in effect, an open challenge to international law and U.S. resolve. That challenge would soon be answered decisively, but at this moment, the confrontation hung on a fragile balance, with civilian lives caught at the center of a rapidly escalating crisis. What the Iranian pilots did not realize during their aggressive interception was that the three civilian tankers were far from unprotected. Beneath the surface of what appeared to be an isolated commercial transit lay a layered and deliberate security posture maintained by the United States Navy. Operating quietly in the central Persian Gulf was the USS Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group, one of the most powerful naval formations in the world. Its presence was not accidental. It was positioned there precisely because of rising tensions and credible intelligence warning of possible Iranian harassment of commercial shipping. As part of standard operational procedure in such an environment, the Carrier Strike Group had already launched combat air patrols to maintain continuous air coverage over critical shipping lanes. U.S. Navy F/A 18 Super Hornets, advanced multi-role fighter aircraft equipped with sophisticated radar, sensors, and long-range air-to-air missiles, were airborne and monitoring the region. Their mission was clear and narrowly defined: protect American flag vessels operating legally in international waters and deter or defeat any hostile action against them. The moment Iranian F-4 Phantom jets descended toward the tankers and began aggressive low-altitude maneuvers, the situation changed decisively. From a perspective of U.S. command authorities, Iran had crossed the line from harassment into overt hostile intent. The sonic booms, threatening radio calls, and attempt to force civilian ships to alter course constituted a direct threat to American lives, property, and freedom of navigation. These actions were immediately relayed through the U.S. Navy's Command and Control Network to U.S. Central Command, which holds authority over military operations in the region. Central Command's response was swift and unambiguous. Given the clear demonstration of hostile behavior toward civilian vessels, engagement was authorized under established rules of self-defense. This authorization was not a spontaneous reaction, but the execution of pre-planned contingency responses designed to protect commercial shipping and prevent escalation through indecision. Once approval was granted, the responsibility shifted to the pilots already in the air. The F/A 18 Super Hornets adjusted course and accelerated toward the intercept zone. Unlike the Iranian F-4s, which relied on visual intimidation and close passes, the U.S. fighters operated with significant technological and tactical advantage. Using advanced radar systems and network targeting data, they were able to track the Iranian aircraft well beyond visual range. The Iranian pilots, focused on the tankers below, were suddenly confronted with a threat they could neither outrun nor outmaneuver. Before weapons were fired, U.S. pilots issued a final warning over international guard frequencies, identifying themselves and ordering the Iranian aircraft to disengage immediately and return to base. This step was both a legal requirement and a final opportunity for de-escalation. The warning made it clear that continued harassment would result in engagement. Iran's failure to comply removed any remaining ambiguity about intent. Within minutes, the engagement unfolded decisively. The U.S. fighters launched beyond visual range air-to-air missiles, weapons designed to strike targets at high speed using active radar guidance. These missiles allowed U.S. pilots to engage from a position of safety, minimizing risk to themselves and to civilian ships below. The Iranian F-4s, aircraft designed decades earlier, lacked the sensors and offensive systems necessary to effectively counter such attacks. The result was overwhelming. One by one, all 6 Iranian fighters were neutralized in rapid succession. The engagement lasted only moments, but it completely eliminated the airborne threat to the tankers. There was no prolonged dogfight, no exchange of gunfire, and no damage to U.S. aircraft. The superiority of training, coordination, and technology was decisive. Crucially, the engagement achieved its primary objective: the immediate safety of civilian vessels. With the Iranian aircraft destroyed, the tankers were no longer under threat and were able to maintain course without interference. For the crews aboard the ships, the sudden disappearance of the hostile jets marked a dramatic shift. From fear and uncertainty to relief and security, though the gravity of what had just occurred was unmistakable. From a strategic standpoint, the air engagement sent a powerful signal. It demonstrated that U.S. military protection of commercial shipping is not symbolic or passive, but active, credible, and enforceable. It also underscored a key reality of modern naval operations in contested regions. Intimidation tactics that rely on civilian vulnerability can be countered instantly when layered defenses are in place. The absence of Allied losses further reinforced this message. Not a single U.S. aircraft was damaged, and no civilian vessel suffered harm. The engagement was conducted precisely within the bounds of self-defense, proportional response, and international law. Rather than escalating recklessly, the U.S. response was controlled, deliberate, and focused solely on neutralizing the immediate threat. In a matter of minutes, Iran's attempt to coerce civilian shipping had failed completely. What was intended as an act of intimidation, instead, exposed a severe miscalculation, one that would have consequences far beyond the loss of 6 aircraft. The skies over the tankers were now firmly under U.S. control, and the balance of the encounter had shifted decisively, setting the stage for the final phase of the operation. The destruction of the 6 Iranian fighter jets resolved the immediate threat to the 3 American-flagged tankers, but from a strategic and legal standpoint, the incident was not over. By attempting to coerce civilian vessels in international waters through military force, Iran had crossed a red line that went far beyond a localized air encounter. Such actions constituted an attack on freedom of navigation, a principle central to global trade and maritime security. As a result, U.S. and Allied commanders moved swiftly to ensure that Iran would be unable to repeat or escalate similar actions in the near future. Even as the air-to-air engagement was unfolding, authorization had already been granted for follow-on operations. The intent of these strikes was not punitive for its own sake, but preventative and strategic, to neutralize the infrastructure that enabled Iran to threaten commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf. This included air bases from which hostile aircraft were launched, radar systems used to track civilian vessels, and support facilities necessary to sustain air operations. The goal was to impose immediate and undeniable costs on any attempt to militarize harassment of civilian trade routes. U.S. Navy aircraft, supported by electronic warfare platforms and Allied assets, initiated a coordinated series of precision strikes against key Iranian military targets along the southern coast. Air defense radar sites were among the first to be hit, effectively blinding Iran's ability to detect and respond to incoming aircraft. By disabling these systems early, U.S. forces ensured air superiority and minimized the risk to Allied pilots. This step also sent a clear signal. Iran's defensive networks could not shield offensive actions against civilian shipping. With air defenses suppressed, attention shifted to Iranian air bases directly linked to the earlier interception. Precision-guided munitions struck runways, aircraft shelters, fuel depots, and command facilities. Aircraft positioned on the ground, unable to take off or escape, were destroyed where they stood. These strikes were carefully targeted to degrade operational capability rather than cause indiscriminate damage. The effect, however, was decisive. Within minutes, multiple airfields were rendered inoperable, and Iran's ability to generate combat sorties in the southern region was effectively eliminated. Allied participation further reinforced the legitimacy and scale of the response. Partner nations contributed intelligence, electronic warfare support, and precision strike capabilities, underscoring that the defense of international shipping was not a unilateral concern, but a shared international priority. This collective involvement strengthened the legal and diplomatic foundation of the operation, framing it as a defense of global norms rather than a bilateral confrontation. The entire operation, from the initial interception of Iranian fighters to completion of strategic strikes, concluded in less than 30 minutes. In that short span, Iran lost multiple aircraft in the air, additional aircraft on the ground, and critical infrastructure required to sustain air operations. Just as importantly, its ability to threaten civilian shipping in the Persian Gulf was severely degraded. For months and possibly longer, Iran's Southern Air Force would be unable to conduct meaningful operations without extensive repairs and reconstitution. Meanwhile, the 3 tankers at the center of the crisis continued their voyage uninterrupted, under protective umbrella of U.S. naval air patrols. They exited the Persian Gulf and proceeded toward their destinations in East Asia. Their cargo was delivered on schedule. Crews were unharmed and the ships suffered no damage. In practical terms, global energy flows continued without disruption, a key outcome given the sensitivity of oil markets to instability in the region. The aftermath of the operation extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. International reaction was swift and closely watched. Shipping and insurance industries took note of the decisive defense of commercial vessels, adjusting risk assessments accordingly. For energy-importing nations relying on Gulf oil, the outcome provided reassurance that critical sea lanes will remain open even in the face of attempted coercion. Strategically, the message was unmistakable. The operation reaffirmed that civilian shipping operating legally in international waters is not a gray area open to intimidation, but protected activity backed by credible military force. It demonstrated that harassment tactics, long used to create uncertainty without triggering full conflict, carry severe and immediate consequences when they cross into overt aggression. Equally important was the precedent set by the response. The strikes were proportional, targeted, and rooted in self-defense and international law. They did not seek territorial gain or prolonged conflict, but rather the restoration of stability and deterrence. By acting decisively and then concluding operations, the United States and its allies reinforce a model of escalation control. Respond overwhelmingly to violations, then stop once objectives are achieved. In the broader balance of power, the incident marked a turning point. Iran's use of air assets to intimidate commercial shipping had been exposed as both ineffective and costly. The loss of aircraft, infrastructure, and operational credibility dramatically altered the cost-benefit calculation of future harassment. Against that backdrop, the central lesson was clear. Freedom of navigation in international waters is not merely a principle. It is a line that will be defended swiftly and decisively when challenged.